am going live on the webinar. Just make sure that's going. There we are. We are on YouTube. And we'll see when we get. We have one person watching so far, and others will probably join very soon. See, I'm just working on the chat here. Okay, I'm leaving it so all messages are visible, but we'll have to be vigilant for spammers and that sort of stuff. Okay, give it one more minute. We're going to talk about, we're going to first talk about Eranos, which is a meeting that went on in Ascona, Italy. I'm sorry, Ascona, Switzerland, on Lake Maggiore. So I think it's on the, it is on the border of Switzerland and Italy. And this meeting went on every year since 1933, except 1989. Now, 1989 was the year the Soviet Union collapsed. Good evening, Art. Welcome. Nice to see you tonight. That's I can't figure out a reason why it didn't happen. But anyway, there's a book, a new book out, which I'm going to share the cover of it here. As soon as I can find it. All right, so here's the cover of the new book. Are you seeing it? Yeah, should be seeing it. All right, so this is the new book, which is an alternative intellectual history of the 20th century. And it was just highlighted to me by Dr. Thomas Arst, who's the co-editor of Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions. And it's a very exciting book. And I'm also going to share with you the Amazon page so that you can see the blurb. And Nancy, if you click on the cover of this book on this Amazon page, you can read like the first 5 chapters of it for free if you want to. But here you can see at the bottom of this page is a little bit of a very quick and dirty discussion of it. But if you go over here and click on the cover, actually I probably can do that. Maybe let me just try it. Okay, so can look inside. Doesn't seem to want to do that when I'm sharing it on YouTube. So, oh, I know why, because this is a screenshot. That is why it wouldn't show. Okay, sorry about that, folks. But Dr. Arst urged me to urge all those that might be interested to attend this conference in April. And I don't know whether there is space. I know that after January 10th, they opened attendance for the conference to the public. And so, the public can attend this conference. And as I said, it's called Eranos. And it is it's in the continuing tradition. And the powerful thing about it is that the person who organized this thing, whose name is Olga Freeby Kaptein, uh, she invited the leading intellectuals of the day to come each year to participate in Eranos. And I'm going to put it back up there because I want to make sure that um, Jerome has seen this. Uh, so, Jerome, this book that Thomas Arst urged me to read, I've downloaded it on Kindle and I have it coming in the mail. But it's very, very powerful and very interesting in terms of knowing the players of this intellectual history of the 20th century. And so I highly recommend it. Go ahead.
Oh, is this the history of the Aranos meet?
Yes, right.
Oh, okay. Well, that's great because they didn't have the first Aranos meetings. They had a whole bunch of intellectuals from different disciplines get together.
Well, and that's going to happen again. But anyway, this is the conference this year.
Yeah.
And what I was saying was they've opened the attendance to the public as of January 10th. I think they're only allowing 150 people.
Yeah. That'll be great. So take notes when you go.
Yeah, well, I'm going to do that, and I just was going to urge you to come along so that I know someone there. But anyway, so you had heard about the book?
No, I just had heard about. I'd read a lot about the Aranos. Every time they had the meetings,
Right.
and they were just something to behold, and just to hear from all of the leading scholars that they got together and discussed all the ideas from physics and just Jungian psychology and
Right.
other topics. So
Right. So anyway, the book is very interesting, and um, I'm urging others to consider attending uh, so that we can be a force over there. I don't know. I don't know if force is the right thing, but at least have a contingent. That would be interesting. Nancy, why don't you come? You'd be a great one.
I'm not much of a traveler.
But you got to Paris. Doesn't.
I had my daughter with me.
Well, you'll have me with you this time if you want. Uh, you fly into Milan. I'm going to rent a car in Milan and drive up 72 miles. So
I think I'll pass and wait for what you bring back to us.
okay, all right. But Eranos means a feast, and it's a feast in which you bring a gift, and the gift is your presentation to the feast. And so that was the tradition. Now, in my case, I'm not an invited speaker, so I mean I'm invited, but I'm not a speaker. So I guess I don't have to bring that gift. I'm just bringing the gift of me to the event. Um, but anyway, just to mention it so that we might find one or two others that can go and want to go. And I think it's going to be a very interesting few days. And obviously, the leading Jungian analysts of this time are going to be there, including Stephen Eisenstadt, who founded Pacifica, apparently, and Joseph Cambray, Linda Carter, many of the writers that have participated in this series, the volume 4 of this series, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions. Volume 4 is going to be issued at the conference, and they've already started working on Volume 5, apparently. So it's become quite a process, and it has had a demand. And so that's very exciting. But tonight we agreed that we were going to talk through chapters 3, 4, and 5 of I'm just looking at the contents to see what else we should do in the future. But anyway, 3, 4, and 5 for tonight, which is student years, psychiatric activities, and Sigmund Freud. And Nancy was kind enough to do a 5-page outline of it, which is very helpful. So, Nancy, do you want to comment on Jung's two dreams? In chapter 3, he's talking about his student years, and he's trying to decide what he's going to do with his life. And so he has 2 dreams that seem to have been watershed dreams. I wonder if you want to talk about those?
I would love to talk about the dreams because I think they emphasize how important paying attention to dreams is, and how relevant they are to our life in the current time. So could I read
Sure.
Okay. So the first dream is this. In a dark wood that stretched along the Rhine, I came to a little hill, a burial mound, and began to dig. After a while, I turned up some bones of prehistoric animals. This interested me enormously. I knew I must get to know nature, the world in which we live, and the things around us. And I think he makes a good point there. This interested me enormously. And these are like big dreams.
Yeah, so that's actually the most important point probably in that, which is it did interest him enormously. And so we have to be conscious of the fact of the things that get our attention. Okay. For me, I'm cognizant of it in waking life now. So when I have some vision of a movie or something like that that comes into my mind while something's happening, I know that that's my unconscious telling me something. And so there's something in that movie, some piece of dialogue or something, and usually it gives me the actual scene and the dialogue itself, which is important for whatever's happening to me right now. And so, but this is when Dr. Jung, more than 100 years ago now, 120 years ago, was hadn't figured out, along with Freud, how to look at dreams, how to think about them, all that sort of stuff.
Right.
And so, anyway, I interrupted.
Well, he was reflecting back, thinking about these dreams when they got put in the book that we're looking at.
55 years later, right?
Yes, right. And that's important too, because they can still stir us.
Sure.
So this is the second dream, and Jung is speaking. I was in a wood. It was threaded with water courses, and in the darkest place, I saw a circular pool surrounded by dense undergrowth. Half immersed in the water lay the strangest and most wonderful creature, a round animal, shimmering in opalescent hues and consisting of innumerable little cells, or of organs shaped like tentacles. It was a giant radiolarium, and that's a little aquatic animal with a spiny skeleton. But in this case, he's got a huge one, a giant one there. And it certainly is a dream that catches me. It's a beautiful way of describing the dream. There's a lot of beauty and amazement as I read that.
Right. And I'm just going to share very briefly your notes here, just so that folks can see the picture that you provided with your notes, which is here. These are basically jellyfish. That's what I got from what he was talking about. But these are
They do have a spiny skeleton of silica.
right, right. And so this is the type of creature that he found, and they were luminescent. It was luminescent in the dream. So go ahead.
He goes on to say, it measured 3 feet across. It seemed to me indescribably wonderful. And there's another, that's numinous. We would probably say numinous.
Yeah, now we would say.
Now we
numinous,
would
yeah.
say that. Wonderful that this magnificent creature should be lying there undisturbed in the hidden place in the clear, deep water. It aroused in me an intense desire for knowledge.
Right.
And of course, these 2 dreams helped him decide for science as a career. They came just at the time he needed them so that he could make that decision.
Right. And that's when they would come, right? Because it's like God knows that you need these things, and this is the thing you need right now, and it's presented to you.
That reminds me of when I first looked in a microscope at paramecium and amoebas.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just like a whole world. The dream reminded me of that, and I was just fascinated. And that is a reason that I originally I wanted to major in biology, but and then I got into crystals.
Ah.
And then crystals got into radio, and that got into electronics. So,
so one thing leads to another.
Yeah. So anyway, but that dream reminds me of that. I was just absolutely stunned and amazed that these little things were moving around. It was just absolutely fascinating.
Right. So also, I just remind you all that in when was it? I guess it must have been a Mysterium when Dr. Jung in his book Mysterium Coniunctionis, and he was talking about what the alchemists were doing, and they were describing creatures that are something like this, because again they were round and so on, but that they would stick to the sides of ships. And so the alchemists in their day were looking for matter that either stuck to things or was pushed apart by things. So the most obvious example of that is magnets, of course, which either, depending on which end you're holding together, either comes together or pushes apart. And so one of the big things that the alchemists were doing was looking for substances that had some sort of spirit between them. They thought of it as a spirit between them, that would be the Spirit of God telling them what to do, basically. So that also, and that's related to writing that he did at least 50 years later. So, okay, going on, and we're going to talk about Jung's personalities, number 1 and number 2. And do you want to talk about that, Jerome, or Miles? I mean, I'll be happy to talk about it if you want to, if you want me to, but.
Well, I thought, yeah, I could talk about it because as I've mentioned before, I've always thought of personality number 2 as, from a young child, as being active, and I just knew stuff, and I could know stuff, and I was wondering about this strange world that was going on and what people were doing, and so eventually number 1 develops, and
Sure.
you supposedly leave behind number two. And you could say at a certain point in time, the ego, when you get a stronger ego, it kind of drifts back. But I've always been in contact with it. And I don't know, I think Jung was also always in contact with it.
Surely, no
Uh,
doubt.
and it's kind of working back and forth, but there is a point where I think you get into that ego inflation. You develop a strong ego. You're
Mhm.
successful in business, and and then all of a sudden you may realize that uh, you can be brought back to that personality number two, and so it may take over. So it's kind of a back and forth situation, but I understand what Jung is saying, but it's kind of hard to describe
Well,
if you haven't experienced it. I mean, that's just my experience, but I can't speak for others.
okay. Miles, did you want to say something here? No.
Yeah, oh, is my audio okay?
Yes, yes.
All right. So I have some notes from when I read this. Must have been a year ago or so. And what I just found interesting was, from page 45, I believe, he's talking about number one, the schoolboy of 1890. Beside his world, there existed another realm, like a temple, in which anyone who entered was transformed and suddenly overpowered by a vision of the whole cosmos, so that he could only marvel and admire. Forgetful of himself, here lived the other, who knew God as a hidden, personal, and at the same time supra-personal secret.
Yeah.
Here nothing separated man from God. Indeed, it was as though the human mind looked down upon creation simultaneously with God.
Yeah, I think the most important word in what you just said was supra.
Yeah, and I know the first time I ever heard that, it really struck me, is when you used it. Did you want to talk about the supra?
Yeah,
Natural.
because it sort of, for laymen, including me, it sort of went over my head for many years of reading. Okay, it is throughout Dr. Jung's works, and it is in a lot of Jungian analyst writings, but I just wasn't grokking what the heck it was talking about. But what it's talking about is the unconscious. Okay, so it's not supernatural. It's not Santa Claus or Superman or anything like that. Um, it's supranatural, which means within nature, and in this case, it's meaning within you. You know, at depths in your unconscious. And I think what he's talking about in this chapter is that these were his first inklings of the self. I think personality number two is the self, and he was becoming conscious of it. Personality number one is the ego, and so we all come out of the self, and it's this very amorphous thing which we sort of have to fight our way out of it until we're well into our teens at least. But you can tell on a child when the ego starts to form, because the child says no. Okay, and when your child says no to you, then their ego is forming. That's what it means. And that's a good thing. And shouldn't be discouraged, because it means that they're developing the ego that they'll need to live their life and support themselves through their life. And obviously, if you're a parent, you're not carrying them along forever.
Are we? Oh, I'm sorry. I
Go ahead.
interrupted.
Go ahead. No.
Well, I was just wondering. I've heard the number 2 character defined in so many different ways. Would you call it the psyche? Would you call it the unconscious? Would you call it the self? The archetypes, the instincts?
Well, I mean, all those things end up sort of being the same thing. But I would definitely call it the unconscious, the things that we don't have in our conscious mind, whatever that is. So that could include the collective unconscious. Now, Dan asks, what recommendations do we have on symbolism on the female subconscious, please? Okay, so Dan, I would recommend Jean Gennaro de Bolin's book, Goddesses in Every Woman. And I would also recommend Esther Harding's book, which is called The Way of All Women. And there's also a book by Robert Johnson called She. Okay, he did a book called She. He did another book called He, and I've been pushed to get He, so I got it in the mail today because I wanted to read about men. But I think he also did a book called We, and so those are 3 examples. Opal Sparkle says, I think Dr. Jung was a closet believer in the paranormal. He wasn't a closet believer in it. He was a full-on believer in it. and that's good. I mean, that, because that's reality, and it's not, we have to start being conscious of the fact that, we we get messages out of the air that come to us and do things. And so this is the way we are. I mean, the problem with other forms of psychology is that they're based on rationalism, which means that they're based on statistics. So if they see a symptom in you, they'll say, okay, 90% of people who have this symptom have this problem. But the problem with statistics is you might not be in that 90%. You might be in the 10% that isn't that. And so that's one issue. And that's why Dr. Jung insisted that everybody be analyzed individually, and also that he was working with the way our unconscious and our psyche actually works, okay, not by any other construct. In other words, our psyche actually works by presenting images to us. That's how it does it. That's how it communicates with us. And if we don't pay attention to that, then we're going to miss something. And
I think Jung was had a very transparent window between the two. So the messages that he saw were coming from everywhere, including God. And I think that's what Miles was trying to say. It's personality number 2. He never, he always said, I allow everything to come out from me. I just allow it to come out. But he had a very transparent window, and you have to realize that a lot of people don't have that transparent window. So,
well, and one of the purposes here is to sensitize people to that.
That's the idea, yeah. In other words, by examining your dreams and you're trying to get, or meditation, you're trying to get back into that window to establish contact
Right.
with that. And I could also, I haven't talked about have I ever talked about the witness physician?
No, but go ahead.
Okay, there's something called the witness physician, which is, it's always been with you and it's always been there. And a lot of people just don't recognize that. It doesn't move really, but it is the kind of the source, or from the self, that comes from that. And so I also think that he also had that witness physician at the same time.
Right. Sean makes an interesting comment here. He says, the devil is always in the detail. That's why the Buddha way of thinking allows you to detach from logic. And he says, I think in a very stressful environment, it's actually a requirement that you learn to detach. And yeah, I guess so. I mean, I was thinking about my Vietnam experience, and I wouldn't say that I was actually detached, but it was like, I wasn't seeing the danger to myself. I was just in the, I guess I was in the automatic flow, and so in some sense I was detached. For example, and I guess that comes from training, okay? Because, for example, on one occasion, I walked behind this large rock, and there was an explosion on the other side of the rock. So I was untouched, but the 8 Marines in front of me were all wounded, and one of them was killed. And so the next 1 hour was taken up with carrying these guys back up a mountain. We were on a mountainside, and the enemy had detonated a 500-pound bomb that had been a dud. And so they had booby-trapped it so that they could detonate it at a right moment. And so these Marines came into view, somebody pushed the button, and boom, these 8 Marines were injured. And, the fellow that had like 200 holes in his body, I helped carry up the side of this mountain, and he literally died in my arms, this man. It was surreal in a way, because it didn't seem like he was injured at all. It just seemed like he had all these little spots of blood on his body. But of course, in that environment, you couldn't tell how badly he was injured, and so on. And so I guess it's right that it became kind of surreal. It became an out-of-body experience where you weren't really thinking that this was really happening to you, but it was, and you definitely weren't thinking about how dangerous it was to you. Okay, it was just, okay, these Marines are injured. We have to medevac them. We have to get them up to this place where a helicopter could get in close enough to pull them up into the helicopter in a jungle sling. And this helicopter pilot came in right against the face of a mountain and hovered for 45 minutes while we got these 8 guys up to the helicopter in a jungle sling, because he couldn't land. And I read the citation a year later where the pilot got the Distinguished Flying Cross for his action. And in a hot LZ, a hot environment, he held this helicopter still for 45 minutes while we got these Marines out. And, I have a clear memory of the events, but a very detached memory. Okay. Not a memory of fear, or whatever. But anyway,
I would also add that detachment's different from disassociation. So you don't want to disassociate, because that is a different subject.
how would you describe dissociation in that environment that I was
That's when you
discussing?
go into a psychic meltdown. So you dissociate from what you're feeling.
Oh, okay. So you become catatonic and you're not able to take care, and then you have to be medevac too.
Right, then you're on the trip, yeah.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to point that out. It's that sometimes we use the term detach loosely, because you can, for instance, some of the training is to detach yourself from your thoughts. Well, that's not disassociating at all. That's just you're detaching yourselves from.
I mean, I definitely was not having a mental meltdown myself.
Yeah.
And
So
I can't speak for the others. But but I just don't remember the incident as being frightening at all. Okay. In other words, this happened. We need a medevac. Somebody calls in the medevac. The medevac comes. We get the guys up into the helicopter, and away they go to 95th Evac Hospital. And and okay, what's next? Right? That's kind of the way it went.
yeah, you were focused on the mission, and
Right.
you didn't have time to do that. And I think Sean says there was no fear left for you, Skip. So
Yeah, I mean, it's not that I was so courageous. It was just because it wasn't a question of courage. It was just a question of not being afraid in the situation. And it, so there was never any question of courage or thinking, oh God, I'm going to have to pull myself together so I can be a courageous lieutenant and do this thing. It never occurred to me. We just, were carrying these 200-pound guys in their flak jackets up the side of this mountain, which was like that, and anyway, okay. I mean, there are many cases like that, and I had a mild experience in Vietnam, so I don't want anybody to think that I was in any way courageous, but that particular time I think of when I think of this, and I say, well, there just wasn't, it wasn't ego, it wasn't self, it just was, right? And so Sean may have the right idea that it was self, and the self just took over, and based on our training, we all, not only me, but there were another 20 Marines that were working on this project to get these guys out from the side of this mountain. I mean, it was seriously a hairy mountain. And so anyway, but so I agree with you, Nancy, that it's all these things. Okay. In other words, personality number 2 is the psyche. It is the collective unconscious. It is the self. It's all these things. It's everything that's not in your consciousness, right? And somehow it's impacting you. And then there's your consciousness, which is the ego. So at this point, Jung is having this dream about going along with this little candle or something in his hand, and he has to keep this candle burning, and there's this menacing figure behind him, which is actually his shadow being cast behind him into the mist, and it's big, and you can't, he couldn't figure out what it was. So in this particular chapter, he's trying to give a sense of the fact that at this point in his life, he didn't really know. He says no definable character, as Nancy says. He didn't really know what the self was, and it was only after another 50 years or 60 years actually, that we really have a full accounting of what the self is. That he didn't even know what it was at this point in time during his student years. So let's see.
Yeah, he was the pioneer in all this stuff. So he's helped what we understand of him. He didn't understand that at the time. So
yeah. And Carl says, I was detached from a feeling of it being real. Well, it certainly seemed real at the time, but I do agree with you that it was detached from feeling. Okay, there was not really any emotion involved. It was just executing what we had to do to get these guys out and save their lives. That was it. And Tor, that's the FGHG guy. This is Tor. Another take on this: someone left a booby trap and just left, so there was no imminent danger of the attack after the bomb went off, and your unconsciousness knew it wasn't as dangerous as other times. Yeah, that's arguably true. Okay, because I don't remember any firefight around the event. I mean, the bomb went off. The Marines were all injured. There wasn't somebody trying to shoot up the Marines. And actually, the night before this, we had killed a Viet Cong outside of our camp place, our camp where we were camped, which actually had been their camp. We had actually killed a guy. So probably he just wanted to do the damage he could do and then boogie. And he may have been killed. There was another one that was killed that night or that evening. There was another shooting at the point of the company going down the side of the mountain, and late in the night, in the dark, he was calling for help, I believe, but we didn't dare help him because it was dark and we didn't know whether he was going to try to shoot us or what. So we left it until the morning, and by the morning when we went out, he had bled to death. So he may have been killed in that event. Sadly, I mean, that's what happens in war. Yeah, Carl says he meant disassociation, and that was not me. I was not, I wasn't catatonic or anything like that. I mean, I definitely did my mission that day. Okay, so moving on. I just wanted to comment that it's number one is ego, and number two is later identified as self. But here at this time, in this particular writing, Dr. Jung is talking about the development of his unconscious and his self. And at that time, he was vague about what it was. Okay, so then Nancy brings up the Dr. Jung's father complex, which really went on throughout his life. I think basically all of his work was because of what he had seen happen to his own father. And his father had been a Swiss Reformed pastor who had lost his faith, and he died when Jung was 24, I believe. And his father died young, and his father was the pastor of this little church, but he couldn't sell it anymore because he didn't feel it anymore. And so Dr. Jung realized that his father had never had a religious experience. And, you know, a problem between fathers and sons, you know, I had troubles talking with my father about certain things, I think, over time. And I think we all do, maybe. We're all intimidated by our fathers in some way. And so he was never able to, and his father was very sensitive because he was a pastor and because it was his profession, and yet he knew that he hadn't had a religious experience. So he knew he was just going with the program. You know, let's just, you know, trot the ritual out and hopefully it'll help somebody type thing. Unfortunately, I think there are a lot of pastors like that who just, you know, go through the motions but have never had a religious experience. Nancy, you've run into quite a few. What would you say about that?
Well, it's hard to say. That sometimes they've had an experience, but it's a long time ago, and they're still talking about something that happened on the mission field, and they're ready to retire, and they were on the mission field in their 20s.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't, you know, this particular pastor didn't have a new experience. I mean, if one has that flow going, I mean, one is changing, one is having synchronicities, experiences frequently. And I would say most of the pastors that were pastors, I mean, there are pastor teachers, there are pastors, and the pastors are the ones that hold the hands and visit the hospital and marry and bury and so forth. And in their love and compassion, I think they reflect a connection to God, whether they're aware of that. I asked one pastor, you know, what is where do you feel connected to God the most? And he said, when I'm talking to another person in the congregation who needs my help, then he could feel this flow.
Right. And of course, Dr. Jung pointed out that all the religions are really grand schemes of mental health. And so obviously when you get in the flow of helping someone, especially someone who's in serious trouble, you know, you literally have the hand of God on you, and you can feel it. Now, Opiami said, okay, so Opiami asks this question: how can you judge if anyone has had or not had a religious experience? And I would say that you can't tell from outside whether someone has or has not. But, you know, what's telling is Dr. Jung's answer that's on YouTube here when he's asked, do you believe in God? And he says, I have no need to believe, I know. And I had an epiphany at that moment because I know. And then, so I said, oh, wow, I know too. So now what do I know? And so it took me 10 years to work it out, and a lot more religious experiences. I mean, at that moment when I had that epiphany, all I could say is, yeah, I know. And then I got to the end of the video and I said, oh my goodness, I know, but what do I know? And it took me 10 years to figure it out. And in that 10-year period, I had a lot more religious experiences, and then I knew and I know. And so when I gave my talk called Finding the Living God, which you can find on this YouTube channel, I gave about 45 minutes of examples of my personal religious experiences so that people could see what I'm talking about. Now, when I talk about it, I can only say, well, these are my experiences. They may not affect you. But nonetheless, I think that there's pretty profound. It's very hard to get a religious experience on either a camera or on a video. But in that talk, I included mine. I've got 2 on video and several on cameras. So,
Well, I think the text that we're referring to, he said it was equally clear to me that it stood no more need of proof than the beauty of a sunset or the terrors of the night. So his proof was just the beauty of the sunset or the terrors of the night. He didn't need any more proof about the beauty of.
well, he didn't
things
have
that
any more
surround him.
proof, but we're talking about how you can convince others of it. I mean, I'll just show one of my experiences, and these things often come up in traumatic times. But
I think poets and been trying to describe this, musicians.
Okay, but this was a decapitating one here, where I was going through a trauma at the time. I had gone into the Naval Academy Chapel in the morning, one morning, and it's about 10:30 in the morning, and the chapel is completely dark except for light from the stained glass windows and the windows in the dome. And I'm in an attitude of prayer and trying to deal with my trauma. And all of a sudden, this light came on me, and it completely changed my attitude instantly when it happened. And I said, "Oh my God, nobody's ever going to believe this." So I I took my iPhone out and took that picture. And, that's sort of a classic image of someone having a religious experience that you might see in a movie. And then I turned it around and did this selfie just to prove how dark it was and how this light was only on me. And here I am in this church with 2,000 seats, room for 2,000 in this church. And this is actually a stained glass window here, so you can see how dark the rest of the day was too, even because that's a stained glass window to the outside there, and you can barely see it. It's so dark, and yet this light was only on me. And I said, that's an example that was convincing to me, and whether you believe it's a religious experience or not, man, that's good enough for me.
I'm wondering if that person is asking how to recognize a religious experience when you have one, because they do vary in intensity. It can be something like a beautiful, stunning sunrise that hits you in a certain way,
Sure.
and kind of lifts you out of yourself.
Right.
So it can be something like that. It can be a synchronicity. A spiritual director sits with a person and has them talk and can recognize when, just through practice and training and intuition, recognize when the person is talking about something or getting close to something where they've had made contact, let's say, with the self or with God, and continue to draw them out in a way that they actually then recognize they've had a religious experience. Many people dismiss them until
Right.
they have an idea of what's happening.
Well,
And some get so scared that they run from it and won't go anywhere near it ever again.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. And I think many of them are quite mundane. And I'll just give you an example that happened last week, because in the advanced group, as you probably remember, Tim was talking about getting in, how he used to get into a kind of a depressed state when winter would come. And but now he's gotten to a point in his life where he actually looks forward to that time as a time of rejuvenation, right? And so right after we had that conversation, I got up from this desk and went out to pick up my mail. And in my mail was the monthly alumni, the U.S. Naval Academy Alumni Magazine. And in that magazine is this article called Life After the Dark Ages. And this is literally um, a logo style advice about its training, basically about how to get through the winter months, because midshipmen get quite down. There are 4,000 of them in one building, and they're it's dark, and all they're doing is grinding it out for several months. There's no parades or anything. And so there's 6 recommendations here for dealing with this depression. And here they are. 1 is stick to a routine. 2 is master things under your control. 3 is do the right thing. 4 is avoid the urge to hibernate. 5 is keep a positive attitude, and remember what you're working for. Pick your cliche: eyes on the prize, or light at the end of the tunnel. They can't stop the clock, whatever it is. But this is Commander Doug Robb, class of '05, writing this in the Alumni Magazine as advice for the midshipmen. And literally, by synchronicity, we had just had that conversation with Tim. I got up, and the very first thing I run into is this article in that magazine. And so, to me, that's the hand of God too. Things like that. But you know,
Could I add something on depression?
Sure.
If a person cannot do those things recommended, they may need medical help.
Sure. Absolutely. There's no question about that. I wouldn't question that. And so if you try these strategies, I mean, this is again Logos dealing with a bunch of healthy midshipmen about how they can get through their blue funk in the wintertime. That's one thing. But lots of people get depressed, and in fact, places like Rochester, New York, and Zurich are examples. And Zurich is known as I think it's the most suicides on the planet. And Rochester was also well known for lots of suicides because it only averages 35 sunny days in a year, if you can imagine that. And there's reason for that, which is that it's right on Lake Ontario, and so there's often fogginess in the weather around Rochester. It's very rarely a severe clear day there, and so things are a bit gloomy a lot of the year. That's why I live in Annapolis and not Rochester anymore. But by all means, if you feel depressed and you can't deal with it with these strategies, then you should see a doctor about it. That's between you and your doctor. I can't say beyond that. And so let's see. And so Sean says, imagine yourself in a room with God, Job, and the devil. If you can do this and not be frightened like a child, then you're not ready. Okay. Honesty allows you to differentiate truth as a founding principle. And he says, in my opinion, of course, Carl says, I feel like you have to have the experience. And yeah, you have to have the experience and you have to also recognize it. And Tor says, an amazed look on the face would be a good indicator, but that's somebody watching you, not what you experience. And Obiami says it was a first person you felt experience. Carl says, God winks at us at one of these after a breakup this Sunday, linked together with a dream I had, etc. Tor, I think also many drug users have had religious experiences, yes, or they feel they have had them. And, that's the problem where nobody's encouraging drug use to have a religious experience in this group because, we killed, I think in 2018, we killed 72,000 Americans with overdoses. And last year it was a bit less, maybe 55,000 or something, but still a big number. So having a religious experience is something that you should recognize while you're sober.
It's not. It's not necessary to take drugs like that, and it's somewhat questionable. It kind of knocks you. It can give you a numinous experience, but as they're temporary and they bounce back. So there's not. I don't see that as. I would also suggest you can read about other people's religious experiences to see, to get some context as to whether you're having one or not.
Right.
There's
Precisely.
People have been discussing this for forever.
Yeah, forever, obviously, because as Dr. Jung pointed out, all of the major religions had their origins in numinous events, all of them. And so, anyway, Tor says, religiously inclined would maybe put much into anything unusual that happens. History is full of signs from the gods, yes. Sean says, people believe what they want to believe. Simple as that, says Obiami. Tor. And synchronicity answers. So 1 is random, 2 is a coincidence, 3 is a pattern. Logic is small thinking, says Obiami. Yep. And Carl says, I think as to the drugs, he was referring to psychedelics, some oft which aren't directly physical dangerous, but you don't need drugs. You can enter alternate states through breathing and meditation. Absolutely. And, we see just a blazing example of this issue with Jordan Peterson, who obviously had a lot of religious experiences in terms of his fame just exploding after 2016 or 2015. But he ended up in detox, and it almost killed him. So you have to be very careful with drugs. And he's a professional psychologist, so he couldn't help himself, actually. That's an issue.
Yeah, his. Did you see the video? His
Yeah.
daughter came on and said he almost died.
Yeah. And
Coming off of one of the, drugs that,
right.
and it became so habit forming that he's really had the time getting off of it.
Yeah.
And the consequences. And I read up on the drug, and it said doctors don't even know how it works.
Okay. All right. Let's move on now. Paranormal happenings. I don't want to hit this one too much, but I can tell you that there are a lot of things that happen that people, whether they're actually wooey woo or whether they're explainable is a question. Um, I think very largely they're explainable, um, but I do know that Rhine's experiments on synchronicity and experiments on quantum physics, which now prove to be true. They don't know why these things work, and they work faster than the speed of light, but they do. That's paranormal. That's physicists that are struggling with that one. Um, so, why did a knife break into 4 pieces? I don't know. I mean, in the movie A Dangerous Method, they have a scene where Jung is with Freud, and this furniture cracks. Yeah, I say, oh, well, okay, things can happen. And, I don't doubt that there are times when someone can be emitting energy that causes things to happen like that. I don't doubt that at all. And, um, you know, anybody that's fallen in love, uh, you can't explain it, but if you've ever had the experience of falling in love at first sight, that's not normal, that's paranormal. And um,
that'll get you out of your mind.
yeah, and the first time I met my wife, Debbie, she was wearing a dress that was this color. and, uh, and it was this beautiful silk dress that was bright red. And I walked into her office and I was decapitated immediately. and that wasn't normal, but that's the way it is. Um, and so,
Well, and that's a numinous archetypal event, and that's what we're talking about. Is numinous archetypal events. So.
Right, and Dr. Jung commented on his cousin Helly, who had a great intuitive ability when she was young, and got into this, bringing people back from the dead and that sort of thing, seances. And later on, he caught her cheating on that. And, as I've said many times, I mean, I can easily convince someone that the tarot is paranormal or astrology is paranormal or what have you, but in fact, it's not. It's the way your psyche works. That's what it is. And you just know the secret of how it works. That's all. So let's see. All right, let's go on. Anybody else want to comment on paranormal happenings? You must have had one or two, Nancy.
Well, I don't know if you call this a paranormal event, but this is not unusual between mothers and their children.
Sure.
And one day I was very alarmed, feeling very alarmed for my daughter. She was down in Panama with her husband, who was in the Army at the time. And for about 3 days, I spent a lot of time in prayer for her, thinking about her. And when she got back, she said she had been very sick. She'd been hospitalized. I don't know if it was dehydration or just what it had. Maybe she'd eaten something that didn't agree with her, but was really seriously dehydrated. And it was exactly the time that I felt alarmed for her.
Yeah. And you could have paranormal things happen, like people used to talk about gemstones, for example. And there was a period in the 80s when people were very much into gemstones. They still are to a certain degree, but I had an amethyst that was heart-shaped, and I knew it was useful for reducing stress. And my brother was dying during a period when he had 3 liver transplants over 10 weeks, and he finally died. But I had to drive up to Pittsburgh like 5 times to see him. And I remember having this gemstone in my left hand with the point of the heart into the center of my palm. And if I had the gemstone in my hand, my stress level would go way down. But if I took it out of my hand and put it in the console in the car, then my stress level would go boop, 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 boop. And then if I picked it up, then my stress would go down, and so on. Now, I do believe that those things do operate at a level that we don't yet understand. I mean, technologists, IT guys know what crystals are, and amethyst is a kind of crystal too. And all these crystals have resonate at different wavelengths. So, that's what radio sets were 100 years ago, were crystal sets, right? I remember I actually had a crystal set kid as a Cub Scout. And so I had a little crystal that came in my kit, and I could put this piece of wire down on that little crystal and it would receive radio waves. And
they used a cat hair actually to do the tuning on the crystal. So
right. And I don't remember having a cat hair, but I think I had something they might have called a cat hair.
Well, a cat whisker. I'll correct that.
And so you could receive radio waves. So in my view at that time, as I looked at all these different kinds of crystals, which are reputed to do different things, I think it's actually a fact that these crystals, if you hold them and they receive certain wavelengths of whatever it is, energy, that they can help you physically. And I think that it's probably provable in a very scientific logos kind of way. It certainly is provable by me because it happened to me. I have the experience.
The frequencies, each crystal has a resonant frequency and you can tune it.
Right.
Fortunately, what we're doing today and watching all this stuff is brought to you by crystals.
Absolutely. and so, that's kind of paranormal. And so, back 40 years ago or 30 years ago in the 80s, people would say, oh, that's very new agey type stuff. But it's not, it's logos. It actually works, and we just don't know enough about it. And this table turning that Nancy mentions here and so on, the Ouija boards, all those things work in the same way as astrology or tarot does, or reading tea leaves or what have you.
Yeah, I
And
think we just have to keep an open mind about this stuff. We can't just close it off and shut the door. And then that's a lot of what's happened with some of our scientific and, like, physics is the same way. They shut the door and then all of a sudden somebody else opened it and found something new. So,
yeah. And
Tim Holmes is back, says. Hi, Tim.
oh, is he here?
No, he's on the chat. So.
Oh, yes. Hi, Tim. Good to see you. Okay, so Obiami says telepathy is no bull. Absolutely, because between my wife and I, for example, we just know things. We don't even have to talk anymore almost. We should talk more, but we actually communicate in a non verbal way very often, and of course she's very intuitive and I'm very intuitive, so that's why that happens. Okay, and so anyway, then Nancy brings up this synchronicity. So we're talking about this book for those of you who don't know or online, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. We're still in the student days chapter, and Nancy points out that synchronicity is what points Jung to psychiatry. And by the way, Tim, you came up earlier because I got this in the mail immediately after talking to you about darkness in the winter. And
can you check, Tim? It says I just entered on the chat, so it might be.
I don't see him there.
Okay.
Okay, Tim, are you sure you're using the right link? The link I just sent you, because you might be on a different Zoom session, because I'm not seeing you on this Zoom session. So anyway,
just got home.
Okay, just got home. Okay.
I'd just say that, Nancy at the very beginning talked or presented about the section of the single-celled, well, it's not a single-celled, but the organism with the silica skeleton. And, I'm just thinking, as the conversation was, about how indeed what I'm using right now is nothing but silica insofar as the microchips. Everything I'm viewing this iPad on is just matter that, and crystals of some sort that some creator put together. And thinking of how, the passage that I read about how number two is the one that's connected with the supernatural, right? If I recall correctly.
Yeah, pretty much.
That part that I read where, just looking at nature, anyone who has entered nature was transformed and suddenly overpowered by a vision of the whole cosmos, so that he could only marvel and admire. Forgetful of himself, here lived the other who knew God as a hidden personal and a suprapersonal secret.
Yeah.
So, we look at nature and we really stop to think about how marvelous it is.
Yeah.
and life itself seems such an unusual
I think that
coincidence or synchronicity
yeah,
of impossibilities that we are all here. And as you've said in the past, we're it's a miracle, this eternal moment. And those creatures that Nancy had in the illustration on her PDF, those are our relatives. Those are our relations. And the
Right.
indigenous, that's what I love about them. They're always saying, well, we have to think of all our relations. And if you just indulge me for a moment longer on this thought, there was a fantastic little video clip that I saw on Facebook. I suppose maybe some of you might have seen it too. And it's a coyote about to enter into a culvert, but and it's caught on like an animal cam with night vision. And you see this little coyote, and he's about to enter the culvert, but he stops, he turns around, and he's kind of hopping, excited. And down the embankment to join him is a badger.
Oh,
And then
yes.
the two of them go trudging into the culvert to get to the other side, like a couple of boyhood friends, And it's like out of a Beatrice Potter story in a sense. And to think
Right.
that these two very diverse creatures, they seem to be portraying a friendship. And
the coyote was signaling to the badger to
okay, so you
come
saw
along,
that too.
come along. He was waiting for it.
And so this concept of friendship is really ancient, I would suggest.
Oh yeah, long before humans, I'm sure.
And I'd just like to conclude with this concept of friendship, because for whatever reason, I just recently watched a video posted by Washington Post of the prayer breakfast.
Oh God.
And Congresswoman Torres Small, she read from the book of John. And it says that my command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do as I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, because everything I know of my Father, I have made known to you. So anyway, just this concept of being a friend is an ancient one, and in what I just read, a biblical one.
Sure. Okay, well, let's move on because we have a lot to cover. So Nancy points out that synchronicity was what pointed Jung to psychiatry, and that he had read this book by Kraft Ebing. And just by reading the introduction to the book, he knew, it made him know that psychiatry was for him. And I remember how profound he thought that was. Now, moving on to psychiatric activities, which is chapter 4, Nancy points out that Jung's burning question, and this is a very good one, is what actually takes place inside the mentally ill. And, at the time that he was working, there were lots of mental institutions around, but because now we understand these things better, we actually do cure people quite a lot. And I think it's important to remember that neurosis and psychosis are two different things. Okay, so neurosis is a psychological matter. Psychosis is an actual physical problem that needs to be cured by a medical professional. And that's the difference between psychiatrists and psychologists. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor who can prescribe medications to help people who have a serious mental defect. And a neurosis is something like the red state, blue state thing we've got going in the United States right now, where nobody can see a way out, and so one side pulls one way and one side pulls the other. Well, this is true of all dualities that are in your psyche. If you have a neurosis, something is pulling one way and something else is pulling the other way in your psyche, and you have to work your way around it. And what Dr. Jung was talking about from a psychological point of view is that, in most cases, you never cure a neurosis, but you grow out of it. Typically, you get a new attitude or new perspective that allows you to cordon that idea off. So, 20 years from now in the United States, we might be able to say something like, oh yeah, we went through that red state, blue state thing, but now we're out of it, and now we're all Americans again type thing. And we don't see our brothers as enemies. And arguably I would say that already has happened, but people don't see it because people keep staring at the cable television, and the cable stations are constantly haranguing you on one side or the other. And so you think that there's actually this neurosis, when the reality is, if you go to the food store or the drugstore or a movie, you don't even think about it. I never know what political position anybody I run into in the street in the United States is. Unless they're wearing paraphernalia or something that identifies them. But I intentionally don't put anything on my automobile and never have, because it's it's a Dutch thing, Hermedig. I don't want to. It's prideful. It's like the Pennsylvania Dutch don't use buttons; they use hooks and eyes because buttons are prideful. So I don't put things on my automobile, but in most cases, the people that you're passing in on the street every day, when you're driving here and there around your town, you have no clue what they are or who they are in terms of their religious or political beliefs, and yet it works, and we just have to see that. That's all. Okay, go ahead. Other comments on that? Okay. So I'm going to quickly.
I would just like to point out on after Jung's burning question that in those days they focused on diagnosis rather than cure and treatment. Right. So Jung was kind of a pioneer in that.
Right, and that's the that's the fallacy of the scientific method, right? That you diagnose it and then you say, okay, this person is catatonic, so we're going to go put them in that part of the asylum type thing, and we'll give them these pills nowadays. But the point is that these things can, if not be cured, at least they can be lived with. Okay, and we all are neurotic, as Freud pointed out. And so, okay, go ahead. So I'll just quickly read a few things that Sean has said. Da Vinci said that there would come a point that the common person would teach better than the masters. He said that the people's gesture was a better signpost in the direction they should take. This also has a relation to honesty and its importance. I love that video. Then they're talking about the coyote video, and everybody saw it. And then spiritual realizations heal neurosis. And to Edinger's point, that's why we need religion. And Opiami says, I don't think much has changed in mental issues. Mental issues are drug solved, expedited, doorstop doctors and liquor stores. Yeah, but I mean, people, nothing's perfect. I mean, my grandfather died from alcoholism. And so, is that a mental disease? Well, yes, it is. And, if he had gotten into Alcoholics Anonymous, he probably would have been saved. And that involves a religious experience, I believe. I mean, I'm not, what I know about Alcoholics Anonymous is one of the things they're going to do is help you see a religious experience. That's one of the 12 steps.
I'd just like to go back to the person that said that the everyday person will one day be recognized as having greater wisdom than these leaders or elites.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think we are neurotic because we are supposed to live as friends, as that Bible passage says, but our economic system is all about competition and trying to outdo the other person, generally speaking. And it's not an economy based on sharing. I think the younger generation, they're now, saying, I don't have any issue with saying that there is a need for socialism, to an extent, not to crush the individuation process, but such that we should be friends.
Lots of things are socialist. I mean, the socialist canard is just that. It's a canard because we adopted socialist approaches to the fire department, the police department, to city government, to all the way up to federal government, to the military. All those things are in one way or another socialist, and we want them to be. I mean, in my city, which is a city that was founded in 1649, the Historic Annapolis Foundation has a plaque that goes on houses that are protected for historic preservation, but that plaque is in the form of what was called a fire mark. And so in colonial times, there were private fire companies, and if you paid insurance to this fire company over here, if there was a fire in your house, they would come and they would put it out. But if another fire company came because there was a fire call and their fire mark wasn't on your house, they'd let your house burn. and so that wasn't a very good way to run a fire department. So therefore, we have to have socialized various things. And, Social Security has been a lifesaver to many, including me. That's and oh, by the way, that's a contract between me and my government. Medicare too is a contract between me and my government. And so I expect those services to be there and that money to be there when I retire. As all of us are old enough to be drawing on those things. So, all right, let's move on.
Just like one more thing I'll just add, and that is perhaps the greatest messenger of truth and what we're suffering from, this neurosis, I would suggest, is George Carlin, who, you have to sit through some of his F-bombs, but he tells it as it is. He says, baby, it's a club and you're not in it, kind of thing. And, that is a powerful spiritual message for people to consider.
Right. Tim has a funny comment here. He says, the internet reveals us a fairly balanced people parading our neuroses in public. Yikes, very ugly stuff. Yeah.
Well, here sit four neurotics. We have to accept that we're neurotics. So
yeah. So, Freud said we're all neurotic. So anyway, okay. So then there's these case studies about how Jung got into his work, and I'm just going to skip over them because I want to get into the Freud material. But basically, there's about eight or nine little stories here, which Nancy has given us the page numbers to. So the webinar participants have the page numbers, and for the rest of you, we're talking about Memory Streams Reflections. Which book is it on my stack in front of me? So it's this book. In this book, Memory Streams Reflections, and we're talking about pages 115 to 136. And basically, in many of these cases, Dr. Jung is talking about how people were cured simply by gaining a different perspective on things, or at least able to go on with their lives and not be stuck in a bad place. And and one of the key points he makes here, which I underlined, was the cure ought to grow out of the patient themselves. And also there's this mental telepathy aspect, which is that, Dr. Jung got a headache when his patient shot himself in the head, for example. And so, those things are quite real, and we simply don't understand them yet. And the scientific method doesn't allow us to research them. So, because they get to decide what's on the table. And, the scientific method always wants to solve for X and ignore all the variables. But Dr. Jung's work was all about the variables. So if you ignore the variables and want to solve for X, you're never going to understand the things that Dr. Jung was working on, because that was the variables. So anyway.
Well, I think one of the important points that he made, and from Nancy's notes, is that he was talking about schizophrenics, but listening to the dreams and meeting with the people and asking them, he was able to draw them out.
Absolutely.
To a normal personality. And what's important here, it says move into the foreground again.
Yeah.
Because they're in the background and they're lost. and he can move them into the foreground, what's
Right.
here and now. And I
Right.
think that's probably one key concept that I found in this is he recognized that early on. And
Right. And, it's in many cases, it's simple stuff. I mean, I remember uh, a story that was in a book I read in the fourth grade, I think, where the story was that this kid was a weakling and he couldn't hold his own on the playground. Okay, so it's a kid's story. And his father says, well, go talk to this wise old man that lives nearby. And so the kid goes to talk about to the wise old man, and the wise old man says, well, let me think about your problem. But while I'm thinking, you go over here and chop this wood. And so he has a stack of wood that he's got to chop. And this goes on for a couple of weeks. And at the end of the 2 weeks, he's built up muscles. He's not a weakling anymore. The wise old man didn't do anything except made him do what he should have been doing, which was working out. And so, that's the type of way that's sort of the way it works.
there's a lot of wisdom in that too, because you're really having them get out and do something,
Right.
which is.
Yeah, Opiami says it's kind of closet exhibitionism. Social media is the social currency for parasites nowadays. Yeah, I guess that's right. Why do I do it? I mean, this is the 160th group meeting, and I do it because it is what I'm called to do, and so yes, we're kind of sort of parasites in a way. It's not like it pays a lot, so.
I just something just occurred to me today. I got an email from a local organization, and I was invited to take a mental health first aid course.
Huh.
So that's new to me, but it'll be over 12 hours of instruction about how to be a first aider to someone with a mental health issue. And I'm thinking that's going to be very valuable, because one of the things I'm starting to realize is that if I'm ever confronted with a person, say on the transit, on the bus or the subway or the light rail transit system, that just the thing I'm sure is to just get away, because these people who are in these psychosis, is that what we said they are?
Mm-hmm.
There's no reasoning with them, and they're not always violent, but we have cases here in Canada, and it really shocks people, because there are these individuals that have committed horrendous crimes, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, that person has really got to be put away for life. And yet they're diagnosed with a mental illness, and in a matter of a couple of years, they're being released back to the community, supposedly now to stay on their medications. That's a challenge, right, for people to, I don't know what it's like down in the United States, but like there was an individual, it's quite a horrible crime. You might have heard about it. It's not too many years ago. He was on a bus, and he looked at the young fellow sitting beside him, and he got this crazy idea that the fellow sitting beside him was trying to kill him. And he pulls out a knife and kills this young fellow.
Mm.
And I won't go into the details, but it was horrible, on a Greyhound bus. And now he's actually, I heard not too long ago that he's, back into the community and hopefully being watched. But I don't know, do you get those sorts of things happening down there in the States?
Well, I mean, sometimes you get people acting out. You know, I was in charge of a 707 full of Marines going to Vietnam in 1970, and before the plane was taxiing, and one of the troops went nutty and said, "I don't want to go," and he starts screaming and jumping around, and the cabin attendants all freaked out, and of course it's all Marines in uniform in this plane. And I said, you know, this guy's not going with us. It was my responsibility. I said, you know, we're going to throw him out right now. And so they stopped the plane, opened the door. We literally threw him out the door with no stairway. And another kid who had a sea bag comes running out on the tar bag, threw his sea bag up into the plane. We pulled him up in, and zoom, we went. And so I never knew what happened to that kid, but you know, who knows what would have happened. I mean, he might have ended up in the brig for 7 days for disorderly conduct. I have no idea, but you know, or he might have gotten a discharge from the Marine Corps. But anyway, you have to take these situations seriously, and that's what Freud did, which is what now Nancy has pointed out to us, that the big thing that Freud brought in was to start taking neurotic patients seriously. And so that's a key aspect. And of course, Jung and Freud worked together for 6 years and very closely. And then they couldn't get on because Freud wanted to blame everything on sexuality, and Jung said, well, there are lots of other things that you can blame stuff on, including laziness. He included laziness in the group. But the disagreement was Jung was unable to feel that all neuroses were caused by sexual repression or sexual trauma. Jung was unable to debate this because of his lack of experience to support his objection. Right. And, you know, Freud wanted Jung to make Freud, you know, like the god of psychoanalysis or something like that. And he wanted him to be his crown prince and his successor, but he wanted to make a dogma of his sexual theory. And Jung just wasn't going to do that. So that's how they broke up, basically. And Freud also was a rationalist, and so he couldn't feature religion at all. He didn't understand what religion was and what it could do for you. And so he just considered that all irrational and therefore not worth mentioning. And Jung says, wait a minute, we have churches that have been helping people for thousands of years here. You know, it's not like they don't help people. And we're not going to have an answer like that. Any comments on that?
Well, I think Freud's psychology is an extroverted psychology because he looks at the object and the objective level. And Jung, what he found out, he was coming from a subjective realm. Right. And he realized that what Freud was saying is that the libido can transcend and go through different phases, and that's why I disagreed with it. It was not all sexual, so it was a transformation, maybe, of the libido.
Yeah. One other comment I wanted to make on the social networking is I think we're probably all introverts. And so one of the things to understand is just the difference in personality types where an introvert goes to a party and would like to be sitting over in the corner with one person talking, and an extrovert wants to be in a big group in the center of the party telling jokes. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's a different type of personality too. So yes, we are neurotic, but we're also, from a personality perspective, just introverts, and this is how we relate more comfortably with people than although I get along all right when I'm at Sammy's too. Now, Tim made some comments here which are worth mentioning. He says, I had a relationship with a schizophrenic who would come to church for the coffee hour, and he was loopy, called me Bob. He warned about all kinds of dangers. I embraced him as a kind of oracle that I took seriously, like a dream. Good for you, Tim. God bless you. Obiami says, Freud was obsessed with wieners and whatnots, in my opinion. Maybe never found love. Well, there's a funny scene in the movie A Dangerous Method where Otto Gross says to Jung, well, the reason Freud is neurotic is because he's not getting any. and Freud had acknowledged that his marriage was amortized, quote unquote, amortized, when he was 34. Now, his wife had 6 children, and so I think women, got fed up with that kind of thing after a while. And in the old days, there wasn't contraception, so maybe that is why Freud was so hung up on sexuality. But one of the interesting points is about that Nancy makes here is the final break, when Jung decides to publish his material on incest and the concept of libido in symbols of the libido. And it's actually, in English, it was originally Psychology of the Unconscious. And Jung couldn't accept his theories being turned into dogma. And the thing about incest was that Freud had the idea that all men wanted to become lovers of their mothers. And I don't think that's what the Oedipus complex really is about. I mean, that's what it's about in Sophocles' play, Oedipus Rex. But I think for the most part, it's about young people of whatever sex, whatever gender, not wanting to grow up. It's a Peter Pan complex. It's wanting to stay in the family rather than going out and becoming a mature individual adult in society. And, the whole point is whether your libido is pointed out, your libido being psychic energy, whether your psychic energy is pointed out toward being a mature contributing member of society, or whether it's still pointed back at, oh, mommy, protect me type stuff. But it doesn't mean necessarily you want to have a sexual relationship with mom. You just want her to feed you every day. And, certainly we have lots of kids, both men and women, who we've had trouble with failure to launch over recent years. And Brown bears and polar bears, brown bears have the right answer, which is mama takes care of the babies for 2 years. And after 2 years, she gives them a big growl and says, have a nice life. That's it. You don't get any more, kid. So let's see.
Well, the Furaturnis, or the Furella for women, is Marie Louise von Franz wrote some good books on the Furaturnis. If you're interested in reading up on that particular, the never grow up Peter Pan syndrome or whatever.
So the Love Doctor, and I'll just point out to Tim that the Love Doctor is our friend Nicole. The Love Doctor says, I am a crazy good question. A lot of crazy people in positions of authority, so-called experts in their field, project their unowned crazy stuff on others using projective identification. Yeah, I agree. Let's see.
That's also, we're dealing with the shadow. So you need to look at your shadow so that you don't project that particular projection on people.
Okay. I'm going to hide a response from Ati K, not because you're not correct, but I don't want you to use that kind of language in our chat. And so I'm going to hide that language. And if you want to recast your statement without using language in that way, I'll accept it, but I'm not accepting what you already wrote. I'm sorry. His basic point was that Jung and Freud broke up because Jung was having a love affair with Sabine Spielrein. But I don't believe that that's what the main reason for the breakup was. But anybody can make a comment on that. I certainly will acknowledge that he was having a relationship with Sabine Spielrein, but I don't acknowledge that that was the reason for the breakup. Info Overdose says, what is the meaning of the crucifix in dreams? And I would say, what does the crucifix mean to you? Nobody can tell you that except you, I think, because I have no idea what your personal background is, so we can't really talk about the meaning of symbols per se in that way. Jeff Hatfield says it's a quaternity. Yes, it is a quaternity, but and Jeff Hatfield says, I want to read Puer Aeternus. Her translation of Aurora Consurgens was very interesting. Yes. Okay. All right. So moving on. So there were further disagreements. The disagreement about the attitude toward the spirit, that's certainly true. And then the numinosum. Jung believed that numinous experiences elevate and humiliate simultaneously. Certainly it does that. And numinosum is dangerous because it lures men to extremes so that a modest truth is regarded as the truth. Okay. So that is an issue. In other words, you have a religious experience, so then you go out and say, oh, I'm destined to be this or that. And that can definitely get you into trouble. And
that's an inflation.
That's an inflation,
ego.
Precisely.
And it's just, they take the experience and they think that's it. And that's not it. You're going to have these along the way until you stabilize, and you may get into the flow flow period, but that's not too many people do that.
Right. So Opiami says love triangles are weird, spurious, mostly, all sides fibbing. Yes. Okay. So, Victorian women would just close their eyes to what their husbands were doing on the side, and we have 50% divorces in our country, and I think young women have been taught over the last 40 or 50 years that, if there's one example of the husband not being pure, that's the end of the marriage, and they walk out on it. And of course that's you have to work through it, but that's also causes a lot of problems in society. That you have children that grow up without a parent and that sort of thing. And any comments on that?
One of the things that struck me that Jordan Peterson said is that the most hurtful thing anyone ever suffers is betrayal. You can tolerate a lot of physical pain better than betrayal. And I think that's where, we really are social creatures, and we're looking for a relationship. And ultimately relationship with the source or the unconscious or God, I suppose, whatever word anyone wants to use. So anyway, betrayal is what he finds is the most difficult thing people who come to him are trying to come to terms with. And so I think that's where in a marriage, especially, when you've gone through a public ceremony and you've exchanged vows, and then one of the two betrays that. And especially, it's probably if the person would have, again, it's unrealistic, but if a person said, I'm not going to betray you, but I don't think this is working, so we need to split, that'd probably be something a person could handle. But having something going on behind their back for who knows how long, that's very damaging, I think.
Well, I think we don't give young people good advice anymore, because if we tell people that, betrayal is the end of the world, then yes, they get betrayed and then that's the end. But, when I married Debbie, knowing what I knew from my first marriage, I said in our wedding vows, I will not accept any promises. I'm not going to make any promises. And because my first wife, every time we had an argument, and this wasn't over betrayals, but every time we had an argument, she was beating me over the head with, you promised X, Y, Z. When we got married, you're in our wedding vows, she'd keep hitting me over the head with promises. And I'd think to myself, hey, what about you? You made promises too, and so we would just spin up this argument, and in the end, we couldn't stop that. And so in my wedding vows of my current marriage, which has now lasted over 35 years, we have vows, but they're vows that are based on Khalil Gibran's on marriage from the Prophet. That's what we read as our wedding vows. And we have one very clear understanding between us, and that is if we ever disagree on anything, we never speak of it again. Okay, and the problem that I had in my first marriage was every time we would disagree on something, my first wife would get the engine running and she'd go back and spin up every argument that we'd had from the beginning. And, that was just hopeless to, because after 17 years, you have a lot of disagreements over this or that. And she'd pull out everything that we disagreed on from the beginning. And, Deb and I made a clear agreement that if we ever disagree, we will never speak of it again. After it's over, we'll never speak of it again. And that works. And I urge all young people to find a way to work it out and then never speak of it again. You can't, if you take your husband back or your wife back after a betrayal, I think that's a bad way of referring to it, because it's not necessarily a betrayal. It's actually us being animals, and stuff happens in life that you can't predict, and you can't predict when it will happen or why it will happen. And so, you're nobody's, or I'm not sure about nobody, but I think that in general, when people get into love affairs, they're very often, they're not thinking, oh, I'm betraying my wife or I'm betraying my husband. They're in a situation that causes that to happen. And then what do you do about it? Okay. And, very often they're discovered. It's very hard to hide such things. And then it causes downstream problems. So you need to work it out one way or another, either between yourselves or with the help of psychotherapists, but then never speak of it again. You can't say, oh, you betrayed me 2 years ago and you were a bad person then, so you're a bad person now. Obviously, that's poisonous. So,
yeah, and I think everything has to be, every story is separate or different. And, in some cases, there may have been the person was under the influence of alcohol or maybe even opioids. These days, a lot of people are using pain medications. And they say that, if you have a beer or a glass of wine, as soon as you've had one, it's starting to affect your ability to think like you normally think. It lowers your inhibitions. And so the first glass of wine, went down nice and okay, well, let's have another one. And then your inhibitions are even lowered and some more. And, so a lot of that betrayal sometimes is due to people, sort of a temporary insanity, as you said. And we do have to say that life is going to be a lot of betrayal. You're going to find yourself betrayed in your job by people you're doing business with. And yeah, you do have to roll with that punch. It's not easy. And that's why I guess psychotherapy is pretty popular.
Well, and you're quite right that these issues, these arguments or disagreements come up on the job too, and you have to get over it and not go back to it and make it cumulative. If you do, you're not going to be able to survive it in the end. You have to move on.
Yeah, it's just in reality, it's going to happen. So you're going to get betrayed. So be prepared, I guess. A good motto. Do you think Answer to Job was a betrayal?
For Jung, yes.
Yeah. So I was thinking of, he said
Yeah,
Job. He said Job, and I went Job. So.
No, Jung knew that it was a betrayal. Okay. And he but he knew what he knew. And that's the significant thing about it, that, theologians had brought the idea of God and the idea of Christianity along for 2,000 years. And so to say that anything about the dogma is not true is a betrayal. Okay, yes, it's a betrayal. And to say that God is both good and evil, okay, he's both sides. From a Christian point of view, which believes in privatio boni, which is, all good is to God, all bad is to man. So blaming all bad things on man and the devil, and all good things are applied to God. Well, the 20th century sort of put the kibosh on that because there were a lot of good Christians that died in the wars on both sides. And so you can't think of it that way. And Jung recognized it. And so in answer to Job, he points out that God has an evil side. And the shame of at least Christian theologians, I can't say anything about Jews or Muslims because I don't know enough about their beliefs, but in Christianity, Christianity is one-sided because of privatio boni, and God is the summum bonum, the sum of all good. Well, God made us the way we are, both good and bad, and we have to learn how to deal with God, and this is what Jung is pointing out in the case of Job, where Job was getting whipped up on by God pretty well because God makes a bet with the devil. I'll bet you can't make Job stop loving God. And what's good about that? And so Job decides to appeal to the good side of God and not appeal to the devilish side of God. And that's how he benefits in the end. And that's the answer. That's what the answer to Job is, that recognizing that God has an evil side too.
Yeah, and I think that's a lesson that Jung was trying to teach with all the shadow and
Surely.
ego and all these relationships that are going on, in our psyche, is to get us to recognize and accept that. And, sure, we're going to be disappointed and betrayed, but how do we deal with that? And that's kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of forewarned is forearmed, as they say, and we learn about these things, we'll be better able to cope with life.
Yeah.
Right.
Be prepared. So
Obiami says to Jerome, you got a fine Southern accent. And
thank you, ma'am. Appreciate that.
Yes, you do. And you have a fine, deep voice also.
And I am from the South, so.
Yeah. And she also says, Christianity is all about sacrifice in a bloody nutshell. Well, I don't think Dr. Jung would concur with that. I mean, I think Dr. Jung would say that Christianity is about individuation, and so Christ lived the perfect individuated life. I mean, that's what he did say in his last speech in the United States in 1937. And I was reading in this book about Eranos that when Paul Mellon and his wife, Mary Conover Mellon, met Jung at that event. They had hoped to have a analytic hour with him, which they were denied. And so he made them chase him back to Switzerland, which they did. And apparently their analysis went well, because then they paid for the Bollingen Foundation and the publication of the collected works in English. So it worked out.
I would like to rewind you back to what you just said, Skip, and that is that Christianity is about individuation. And therein is why I'm now at the point where I'm more comfortable saying I'm not a Christian, because I've never heard that stated in any of my experiences going to the bricks and mortar churches. That
right, because
Christianity is about individuation.
Yeah, because most theologians don't understand that, and that's what Edinger was pointing out in the book, The Christian Archetype, which I read into the channel, so you can hear me reading the entire book. It's called The Christian Archetype, and on the front page of the YouTube channel, you can find the book, in which Edinger goes through it chapter and verse, and he goes through the main events of Christ's life and how they do represent an individuation, because Christ is understanding what his self calls for, and he's living his life fully to that requirement, okay, to his self. And so in that sense, Christ lived a fully individuated life. The only time he stepped out of that was on the cross, when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That was showing his humanity, but in every other respect, he lived his calling to the full as the Son of God. And the point is that in this new stage of consciousness that we're going into, we have to understand that that's symbolic of how we all have to live our lives. We all have to recognize what we're called to do, and then we need to live that calling in as clear a way as we can. So, obviously, long ago, I was called to read. Well, I was called to Jung long ago. I mean, 55 years ago, believe it or not. And it has become a louder and louder call throughout my lifetime, which is why we're on session 160 right now, because it's my calling. But, I know that there were intimations of it back in 1961 when I was 15 years old. I remember the day that Dr. Jung died, okay? And I remember the news report about his death. And other than JFK and RFK, I don't remember the deaths of anybody in the 60s or the 70s, except that why would a 15-year-old kid remember the black and white news report of Dr. Jung's death? I don't know why. What I know is I remember it, and it was noteworthy to me at the time. And, it was something that passed like all other news reports. But now, out of all the news reports and everything that's happened to me over the years, I still remember that newscast about his death. And, and so as things occurred to me that involved Dr. Jung and his work, it's pulled me more and more toward his work. And so I recognize that as a calling now, which, it took a long time to really recognize it as such. But now when I look back on it and look back on my experiences, it's very clear that it was there all the time. I just didn't understand what it was before this. And
Peter Kingsley, in his book, he saw a black and white TV production of Jung. He didn't know who he was,
right.
and then he set out on his whole journey trying to find Jung, but he didn't know why. He just heard him on TV.
Yeah,
on the BBC.
And maybe I had heard that BBC broadcast or something like that. It's possible. I mean, he was in UK, if I recall. Peter Kingsley was.
Right. Yeah.
And so for Peter, he would have actually heard a lot more about Jung, but I was living in a suburb of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I mean, it's remotely possible that I heard that BBC broadcast, but I don't specifically remember that. But I do remember the news reports and the obituaries that were carried on television when he died. That I do remember. So I know that somehow my calling has been to that throughout my life. I can say with 2020's hindsight. Now, Christ in Gethsemane is recognizing that his calling to the cross is part of the deal. That was what he was there for. And so he recognized himself that he had to do it, because he could have escaped that night, right? On the night after the Last Supper, he could have easily escaped. I mean, even today, I haven't been to Jerusalem for a while, but I was in Jerusalem in 2007, and so I saw the layout of the Mount of Olives and the east out of Jerusalem past Hebrew University. And, you could escape from the Mount of Olives today easily because there's not anything out there after you go out beyond Hebrew University. I mean, maybe there's more now with the Israelis settling, but in 2007 there wasn't. And so you could get up on a high road up by Hebrew University and look down into Jerusalem and see the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the West Wall and all that stuff, Mount of Olives. But if you look the other way, I mean, within just turning 180 degrees out from Hebrew University, there you literally don't see any civilization until you get to the Sea of Galilee. You can see the Sea of Galilee, and there's no civilization between there. So, or at least there wasn't then. And so, Christ knew that he could escape, but he didn't, because he knew what he had taught and what his life was about. And he had to live it fully. And so he did. And so when we say imitatio Christi, imitation of Christ, we're not saying that you have to go out and get yourself nailed to a cross, but you have to get yourself nailed to some cross. I mean, you have to decide what it is that you're going to ultimately do with your life and be, in order to be individuated. Okay, that's Dr. Jung's point. You can be an individual, but to live your life fully and wholly, you have to you have to see your life through and your calling through. And Jungian psychology is about understanding what that calling is. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a religious calling. Yeah.
Well, and it's your path. It's not anybody else's path.
Right. I mean, so I know that Miles is retired from the railroad now, but out at that switch at the end of the road where you had a assignment, Miles, at one point, you could have easily said something like, this is at keeping this switch or whatever it was at the end working properly is what I'm called to do, and I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. You could have said something like that, and that would have been a fulfillment of individuation. I mean, you could do that. Now, because you retired and now you're getting pulled into this stuff, now you're called to something new. Okay, that's the same with me. I mean, I was called to the Marine Corps, but that doesn't mean that was my final destination. It was a career that I did, and then I moved beyond it. Right, so I've now been retired. Believe it or not, I've been retired from the Marine Corps for 30 years now.
I'd just like to say one thing, that Christ came to really teach us how to love and really be self-sacrificing in that. And if we just intended to love and do that well, we would be sacrificing every day in many ways, and the ego would get more and more, I don't know what you'd say, tamed, maybe. But just putting love for self, God, and others as your guiding principle,
Sure,
would be an individuating way.
right. So I can give a really nice example of how this works out. So I feel I'm called to this, right? And so I've been trying to do these readings of the Red Book and so on. But this weekend, I had to go with Debbie and her mother to Trader Joe's and see to it that they got around safely and got home safely. And so that's part of my responsibility in life, right? So that's where I'm being crucified, because I'm thinking, oh, I've got to do this for all of my subscribers, but at the same time I have these other responsibilities that are in life that I have to assume my responsibility. I think I'm doing it better than I ever did, because I'm now understanding that better. But so let's see. Yeah, somebody says Nancy is a good listener. Yes, you're a good listener, Nancy. So you were called. You could talk about how you were called.
Well, I was in my 20s, and I can remember one day hearing on the radio an old song by Peggy Lee, "Is This All There Is?" And if this is all there is, let's keep dancing, I think she said.
Mm-hmm.
And that resonated with me. So, is this all there is? And I stepped out on my back stairs one day, and I heard these bells playing a hymn I had sung as a child. And I thought, I'm going to go see where those bells are coming from. And I hopped in the back of a church and hid in the back row and left as soon as I could, so nobody would talk to me. But I began to experience a welling up of something more. And it was a kind of wholeness, a way of being present to wholeness. And that began to draw me in. And then there's a long story that follows.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yes, and if followers or listeners are interested in that story, Nancy's story is in detail on this channel in a series of 5 interviews that we did over a 2-month period that we went through Nancy's life and how she individuated as a Christian. So I urge you to go listen to those, all of them. And there's a couple of bonus videos as well that we had done earlier that we did last May. But the ones we did last fall give a very clear development of Nancy's life and how these things have affected her. And I urge you to take a look at those. So anyway, Opiami doesn't like the word sacrifice, and I think that maybe a better way to think about it these days is the way of yin and yang, and understanding that in our lives we have different dualities that pull us hither and yon. And I think this is what Dr. Jung was getting at a bit in his reference to the way the cross works, that in terms of the cross, there are requirements of heaven, there's requirements of hell, there's requirements of right, and there's requirements of left. And you have to balance all those things in your life that in terms of the cross. But what we have to recognize is that the yin yang symbol is constantly moving, it's not static. And just as a reminder, I can pull it up. Let's see here. Okay, let me just pull it up briefly. And this is one that relates to a family relationship where those 2 waves are constantly turning. And so some things require give and some things require take, and vice versa. And so it's important to keep those things in balance and stay in the circle and keep it in the circle. And if you can keep those things in balance, then you've got a good marriage. And so
I'm thinking that instead of sacrifice, we could just say letting go. And in midlife, when we start to have the ego begin its surrender so that the self can come forward, there's a lot of letting go. And it feels like a sacrifice to the ego, but it really is a letting go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the Love Doctor says, no one is going to come to save you, comes to mind. And I think she knows well enough because she's just been undergoing the fires in Australia, where she had to flee from her home. And so, we each in our maturity have to understand that it's our job to live our lives and to find balance in our lives, regardless of what that may involve. And I think most of us are way too complacent in the United States about our position in the world, because you can lose everything. Just ask me, I know. Let's see. Okay. So anything else that we want to talk about? Next week, we're going to talk about the confrontation with the unconscious, which basically is the Red Book period. And in preparation for that, I've been reading more segments of the Red Book into the channel. So as of yesterday, there are 32 videos of my readings of the Red Book. And on every one of them, I've put the entire playlist so you can see where you are if you're following that playlist. I have about, I probably have 10 to 15 left to go, because some of these segments, like the segment on the magician, are quite long. And so that's going to have to come out in several videos. Yesterday, I read the active imagination about eating the liver of the dead little girl, and I have marked that for adults only, because it's pretty tense. That's what I would say. But
well, you can't take it literally, because if you do, that's when it
no,
becomes tense.
you can't take it literally. But at the same time, even taking it figuratively, listening to the story is pretty intense. And what it's about is the depth of the darkness in all of our souls. That's what it's about. And this is how Dr. Jung was reflecting that through his process, how depraved we really are. And if you deny that, then you're not individuated. And so Dr. Jung was symbolically talking about how depraved you could really be in certain circumstances. And it's not only him that could be that depraved, it's all of us. And we just need to understand that, we're all living on top of a volcano. And we're very grateful for society and civilization to hold it together for us. So
yeah, and that's there's a danger in these archetypal things emerging and causing that to happen, and that's what he's trying to describe.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, so confrontation with the unconscious, I think if we take only that chapter in this book next week, that's probably enough to talk about. And, there are plenty of those segments. So we're talking about, again, here, just say the pages. It's going to be chapter 6, which begins on page 170. And it's this book, as Jerome is pointing out, Memories, Dreams, Reflections by C.G. Jung, from page 170 to about page 200. And I will supplement whatever's in there with a conversation of the Red Book. So if you're not familiar with the Red Book by C.G. Jung, which is over my shoulder here in the folio version, but comes in a reader's edition for about $25. And you can find it electronically on the Dropbox for the group. So if you're not a member of the Dropbox, write to skip.conover@gmail.com, and I will let you in so that you can find the Red Book electronic version. As you see, I've marked a lot of things that I think are important in here. And
There's also a Kindle version, which I've got, which is.
Oh, okay. So you can get it in many versions. You don't have to pay $150 for one like that, although I personally treasure that one. and, and I've taken very good care of it for the last decade, although I may have to get myself another one at some point. But anyway, I will supplement with material from the Red Book, and we'll just talk about that confrontation and that confrontation with the unconscious. And thanks, Tim, for being here.
Yeah.
Joining
Thanks,
us.
Tim. Thanks, Tim.
So we'll see you on Wednesday for the Picasso extravaganza. I'll see if I can find some good Picassos to throw into that. Anyway,
All right.
Okay. So good night, everyone, and
Good night.
I'll
Good
see you
night.
next week. And thank you all
Good
for
night.
coming online and joining us online. I appreciate it, and we appreciate especially the Love Doctor for checking in with us from Australia. So take care now. I hope all is well with you. Peace.